Monday is here, and I was going to give you a few troubleshooting stories and little principles that we can go by. And to start with, you know, some mechanics are always hoping for a silver bullet. You know, if you run into a tough problem you're trying to figure out, and it's always really handy if somebody that's already seen it before comes by and tells you, hey, if you know, whenever I had one of those, I did this, that, and the other, and took care of it, or whatever. You know, I think I told you all one time about that guy that walked over. He was working in the service bay. He's the same guy that got mad because I wouldn't close the doors because he wouldn't change his radio station. But he came over there that one day and he said, I'm having trouble getting this Ranger to idle right. And I said, well, take the zip tube off and spray the throttle body down, clean it up real good, unplug the idle air control, you know, take the battery cable off and put it back on, and adjust that idle stop where it'll just idle, you know, and all that kind of thing. I just give him a bunch of little steps to do and all that. And he actually wrote that stuff down, remembered it, went over there, and he did what I told him to do, and he came back and he says, I guess you've seen that before. And I said, no, I never have. And he grabbed me by the throat. But anyway, Identifix is good, but it doesn't have all the answers. And the problem with going to somewhere like Identifix, or somewhere that you get some good answers from, and there are some good answers on Identifix, but it doesn't have all of the answers, and their hotline people don't have all the answers either. You know, I've had them, you know, lead me down a rabbit trail, and then I found out that you know, we were going in the wrong direction. But sometimes there's just one that you got to figure out right by yourself. And you got to be good at troubleshooting, but it's always so good to remember on your own the ones that you fixed in the past. That helps too. But a lot of people don't want to take the trouble to find out what's wrong. You know, they basically just want to have somebody tell them so they get an easy fix, get it out, and get the next job in there. But sometimes you're just going to have a tough one. Now, any troubleshooting task requires us to gather all the information you can, and we need to put it in categories as far as, you know, what's important, what's probably not going to be pointing us in the direction of the problem. You know, it's always good to gather as much information as you can, because there's some crucial piece of information, or there's some pair of facts that you're going to put together, and they're going to point you in the direction of what the problem is, so that you'll know what you need to do to straighten it out. Now, you can make these different kind of errors. The top one error is when you're thinking a part might be bad, so you replace it, but the concern remains unchanged. In other words, you say, well, this sounds like a TP sensor, or this sounds like I've got a bad coil pack, or it sounds like blah, 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 whatever. And say, now, type 2 error is when you apply analysis, solid testing, and logic. All three of them indicate a particular part's bad. But the problem, even with that, is you can still find out the problem is somewhere else. That's really spooky if your diagnosis leads you to believe you've got a black box problem, which is a computer of some kind, or whatever. There's computers all over these cars nowadays. And you know, for years, whenever the computer first started showing up on the cars, whenever there was a problem, you know, a lot of the mechanics weren't thinking inputs and outputs. They were thinking that stupid black box was a problem, so we're going to throw one of those at it. Most of the time that wasn't what it was. Now, occasionally it was. You know, I've actually seen it where there were problems with the engine controller. Some of the injector driver modules on the Power Stroke diesels and on the vans particularly were mounted so that water would run all in them and just ruin them and everything. And that was an issue because of the place they were mounted. There was one Renault 18i that I worked on. It was probably a car that was worth about $100 sitting beside the road with a for sale sign on it. And the engine controller on that one was under the passenger seat, as I remember, and it had been wet in there enough to where it had cooked that thing. You could take that engine controller, smell of it, and tell it was just fried to beat the band, pull it apart, and it was all burned up in there. Told the guy it needed an $1,800 engine controller, and he said, yeah, go ahead and fix it. You know, well, that car was not even hardly worth giving away, but the guy liked the car, so he went ahead and paid us to fix it. This was a wiper problem that smacked me around. This one here, the wipers would pause between each sweep when they were on high. The wipers would go down, they would act like they were struggling, then it would break loose and it would go down, it would act like it was struggling. It wasn't acting like intermittent wipers. You could tell it would have to strain to break loose from that part. And I'm thinking, okay, if you look at it, the high circuit on this thing, you know, this is when you first, you know, turn on your key. You notice right here, watch this, I'm turning on the key, watch the switch change. All right, I turn on this key, and then you got power coming through this circuit breaker, going down here, and it's basically, it also goes over here. You know, I didn't draw those, but the simple fact is, with the key on, this is going to that electronic switch, and it's going down here. See this park part of it? That park part of it is what keeps the motor powered up until it parks when you turn them off. and see until it comes to that break in that wiper. But I'm saying, well, the way it was acting, and since this thing bypasses, it goes over here. When you turn your wipers on high, it goes, this is the wiper governor right here. And it goes past this straight to the motor. And I says, if the wiper governor is not even in the picture, I don't understand how it could be anything but this. And I figured there was something wrong with the part column. Well, notice whenever you turn on the wipers, this bypasses, and so I said, this could not be what the problem was. So I condemned the wiper motor. And I'm saying, well, the wiper motor's got to be the problem. I'm logically trying to figure this out, right? And I'm looking at the schematic, knowing what I know about wiper motors with their park points in them and all that kind of, that little park strip. I said, this has got to be what it is. So I order a wiper motor. But while I was waiting for the wiper motor to come in, there was another vehicle. This was an F-150. There was another vehicle, a Tempo, that came in with exactly the same problem. And I thought, now that's interesting. And it turned out that they had a wiper motor in stock for that one. And so I went ahead and got the wiper motor and I put it on there, and it was exactly the same problem. So I took the wiper motor back off, and I says, well, I guess it's got to be the governor, but I can't reason out why, whenever it bypasses the governor, why the governor is going to be the problem. But I put a governor on it and took care of that wiper problem. And then I had to go back and tell them that I didn't need the motor that I had ordered for the F-150. Because really what I needed was this governor here. All right, so because of the fact that I needed the governor, and that's what it looks like, it actually plugs in between the harness and the wiper switch, which is kind of interesting how those old things did. And this new, the old parts guy told me, you should have checked that closer because you're just troubleshooting my shotgun. There's not any kind of a bulletin that was on that. The book didn't lead you in that direction. All you had was a wiring schematic and your understanding of the system to make it work. And it was a bad call, but thinking about it logically, it led me to the wrong place. But that's life, But test drives, live, a lot of guys that kind of think they want to be some kind of a drivability technician have the idea that all you have to do if you're a drivability guy is plug in a scan tool, check for codes, pop a part on there, maybe give it a little test drive and throw it back out, and then you get paid a bunch of money. Anybody that has done drivability work knows that it's a lot deeper than that. And somebody that tries to just pull a code, I used to tell my students when I would give them I would plant a bug on a vehicle that they would have to go look for. And they wanted to sit there without even opening the hood and just look at the scan tool and try to figure it out that way. But the thing about it is, you're not going to fix these vehicles consistently unless you're willing to open the hood and put your hand on stuff, listen, look, do all kinds of other inspections under the hood. You got to get your hands on it, on the machine, before you can ever fix it. There's one 1992 Chevy C10. It's a 350 engine with a TBI. It had been in a bunch of shops for low power concern. Nobody had been able to find the problem at the other shops. I don't know how many shops they went to, but it had been at other shops. So we went to the trouble to check the fuel pressure, which is a little annoying on this one. You kind of get spoiled by the fuel pressure schrader that a lot of these vehicles had on the fuel rail. This one never had that. But we had this fitting that we could put in between the filter and the line. And I actually later built a filter that had a port coming off of it where you could check the food. Because the pressure is only supposed to be 12 to 14 pounds on these anyway. Well, we did a T-in at the fuel filter, hooked the gauge up. We had a fuel filter, a fuel pressure gauge that had this with it. And we put that on there. And it turned out that this thing had like 2 to 3 pounds of pressure. It had almost no pressure at all. Bingo! That's what the problem was. And so whenever we got that fuel pressure up where it was supposed to, now I don't know if you've ever seen one of these that had low pressure like that, but that thing runs like it's got the TBI ones. If they've got the 12 to 14 pound system, if it's only got 2 or 3 pounds, it runs like the catalytic converter stopped up. I'm not kidding. You'll give it a gas and it doesn't run like low fuel pressure. It runs like a stopped up exhaust. Anyway, that was a peculiar thing right there. We figured that one out pretty quick. Popped a pump in it. We were good to go. The other troubleshooters didn't check the fuel pressure because it was too much trouble. Whenever I used to have people that would call over there to the shop, when I was at the Ford place, people would call from shops all over that town, which there were shops everywhere in that town. They would call and they would start describing a power loss problem or something like that. and I would ask them, have you checked the fuel pressure? Well, all those, it was fairly easy to check. If you got a fuel pressure gauge, you just hook it up to the Schrader, you know. And they would either say they had checked it when they hadn't, or they would tell me they hadn't checked it, and then they'd come back and tell me what it was, and it would turn out the fuel pressure was a problem. But a lot of the times people want to do the easy thing first. Now, you might remember that sometimes they want to do the cheap thing first too, and that's not a bad idea. But this one guy came from his little shop over there, and he said he had one of these cars that had a little electronic idle speed control on it, and it's got a tracking switch in it, you know. And I had long since got to where I was measuring the resistance for those tracking switches, because that wasn't in the book anywhere. But I found out that a lot of the time it's supposed to be a straight short to, you know, between, you know, that switch is supposed to be a dead short, 0 ohms, and that's when you put your foot on the gas. When you let off the gas, it's supposed to open up. Well, whenever I would, the thing was supposed to be shorted, it would have 60 or 70 ohms, and that would be the problem. And it would make it idle crazy and do wacky stuff. In some cases, it can even make it lose power, but that's sort of rare. Anyway, the point is, I told him, I said, it's going to have this idle speed control motor. And he says, my goodness, can't we, he said, that's $140, can't we look somewhere else for the problem? I said, well, we could, but I mean, if we know this is bad, what's the point? And then I told him, I said, whenever you were working on one that had points in a condenser, and you pull the distributor cap off and saw that the points were burned up, did you say, well, I know the points are burned up, but I don't want to fool with that, so I'm going to go look somewhere else? You're going to start where you see a problem. And a lot of times we have to start where we see a problem, do that, verify the repair. That's part of the process, is verifying the repair. And service writers particularly did not want to hear that you were going to have to verify the repair. A service writer, what they like to do is they like to say, they like you to say, this is what it is, there's no other problem with the car except this, and when I put this on, it's going to be 100% fixed, and I guarantee you they'll never have any more trouble with this car again, they'll never even need another oil change. And that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to come out and sound like a hero. Well, the service writer didn't want to go out there and tell them that, well, you know, we know that this is wrong, but there may be more stuff that we'll find after this. That's just life. That's just part of car repair, and a wise customer understands that. You know, some of them are going to be hard to get along with. One time I went out there and I drew a work order. You know, we had a little tag with a number on it, and there was a tag hanging on the mirror that had that same number on it, so you make sure you're getting the right car. And I went out there one day, and that was, by that time, tempos were kind of going away. We didn't see a lot of tempos. And so I said, oh, this is the tempo here, and saw it on the ticket. So I went out there and I saw a tempo sitting there, got in the thing, you know, started it up, went to back up. I said, oh yeah, I've seen this before. There's a recall on this. This is an engine controller was a problem on that one. And, you know, I don't remember how I arrived at that, but the point is the engine controller was bad. I popped an engine controller on it. We had them in stock. Boom, it ran like a brand new vehicle. And, you know, I had got an okay from the guy that, but it turned out that the key they handed me, I didn't look at the number, which I should have, that was my bad. But who would have expected the key to this tempo to start a tempo that was the wrong one, which it did. And so then I went and found out that, you know, this guy had already okayed a $300 repair that we had done on somebody else's car. Well, the guy who owned the car that I put the engine controller on said, oh, that's great, I'm glad it's fixed, I'll come pick it up and pay the bill. The other guy, all he needed was a throttle position sensor, and his bill was only going to be $60. Well, the service writer had already extracted an okay for a $300 repair from this guy, so the service writer comes and says, hey, since we gave him the wrong information the first time, can we do this for free? And I says, no, we're not going to do it for free. He okayed $300. He's going to be ecstatic that he's only having to pay $60 plus labor, you know. Duh. Anyways, but when you're the last resort, one guy had his van, I may have mentioned before, and he drove all over town. It was stalling or cutting up or something. I don't remember what his problem was. And all over town they were pulling codes and changing parts. And he spent $750. He went from this shop to that shop to that shop to that shop. And he was one of those people that he wouldn't go back to the first shop and tell them it wasn't fixed. He'd go to a different shop, hoping they'd find it. And after $750 later, he was completely exasperated, and so he figured as the last resort he'd go to the dealer. And whenever he got there, I found a little bit of a wire harness scratching on a bracket. And I said, that's what your problem is right there. That throws this code. That's what this wire does. So I, you know, basically just taped the wires up and used a wire tie to get it away from that bracket, and it took about 20 minutes, and I had him charging him $20 at the cashier's office. He was completely stunned, and he told me, he said, if I'd have known this, I definitely wouldn't have gone and let him change all those other parts at those other shops out there. But I don't know if he came back to let us work on his vehicle again or not, but he was really happy when he left, you know, that he didn't have to pay any more than $20. Now, somebody else has exhausted their shotgun. My son was driving this 86 little LTD, and this is exactly, I found this picture online, but this is exactly like the car he had. I mean, just exactly. You'd think it was the same car if you saw them sitting side by side. But anyway, this car right here was, whenever I bought it for $550 from a guy that worked at a parts store. And him and his wife wanted to just get rid of the car because he had replaced every part he could think of from the parts store where he worked at, but the car still wouldn't run but 40 miles an hour. Then the vacuum test showed the catalytic converter was clogged. So, you know, the catalytic converter was one of those you could actually take off of there and hold in your hand on that particular car. It was just one little, it wasn't welded into a longer pipe. And it was very easy to take care of that problem. Well, I fixed that. Well, about 20,000 miles later, it developed a transmission overheating problem. It was a C5. It would start to boil the transmission fluid out in a red mist behind the car on a 30-mile drive, which, you know, it was, yeah, granted it was summertime, but it shouldn't have been doing that. So, on that one, I said, let's start out by doing this stuff that we know will probably help, because what kind of troubleshooting can you do on what the transmission's overheating for, you know what I mean? So I put an external cooler on it. I could have just probably put a radiator in there. I imagine it probably had crud all piled up around the transmission cooler and wasn't cooling good. Put an external cooler, change the fluid, replace the modulator valve. No more problem. He was good to go for that. That one didn't require a lot of troubleshooting. It required some logical steps, you know, to try to solve the problem. This was a kind of a high mileage car anyway. And a high mileage car, a lot of the times, there's things you can do. There's things I'll do on a high mileage car to do a safe and effective repair that I won't do on a car that's a whole lot newer. If it was a whole lot newer car, I'd probably put a radiator on it. But these coolers at the time only cost about $30, you know. All right, troubleshooting though is 90% of a successful repair. And a surgical repair makes a lot more difference. I don't know if these people that you've heard talk about when they're trying to impress you with how good a mechanic somebody is, they'll say, he can take it apart and put it back together from one end to the other. Well, that sounds good. But a mechanic typically only tightens the one bolt that's loose or replaces the one part or fixes the one wire that's shaved or something like that. He doesn't rip it all apart and put it all back together. You know, that's TV land stuff. I used to get tickled when I would watch the Dukes of Hazzard, how that mechanic that they had on there, that one episode of Dukes of Hazzard, they had somebody that was, you know, running the countryside on four-wheel drive trucks making trouble, and all they had was their General Lee car, and so they asked the mechanic, I think his name was Cooter or something. Anyway, they asked him, I said, hey, what can you do with, you know, can you turn the General into a four-wheel drive? How long would it take? He said, oh, I'll probably do it in a couple of hours, you know. He never asked for any money or anything. He just worked his rear end off for them 2 hours to turn a 70 Dodge Charger into anyway. But some problems could have unusual causes. We're going to encounter a problem that's really tough to figure out sometimes. All right, look at this one here, this situation here. 5 volts, 4 volts, 3 volts, and 2 volts. Nothing was connected to this. This is your self-test input on the VIP test connector. You know, it's a 5 volt. When you short that 5 volts to ground, it starts to flash the codes out on this right here. Or if you've got, you know, your live data. But the point is, you're putting it in a self-test by shorting that 5 volts to ground. This one would not go into self-test. And so, no matter what I did, so I even shortened it to ground artificially right here, and you're not going through the tool. And so I measured the voltage there, which is what I like to do, and I got 2 volts there. I said, what the heck is that? And I said, I wonder if there's a problem in the engine control. So I went and measured it back over here coming out of the engine control. I have 5. The closer I got to that connector, 4, 3, 2, that makes no sense at all. I absolutely cannot reason out. Even if that wire was bad, even if it had a single strand, if there was no load on this wire, why would that be 2 volts and that be 5 volts? That just makes no sense. You know, that sounds like you're making it up as you go. But that's one of the things that I had run into. I've seen other wires too that acted like there was something wrong with it. You could actually get the machine to tell you there was a problem right there, but when you pull the wire out of the harness without cutting it or anything, you couldn't find a problem with it. Keep your knowledge to yourself. I've worked with guys that try to do that. They want to be the one that's indispensable, that nobody knows what they know and all that. But I found out a long time ago that every time I explain something to somebody else, I understand it better myself. You have to process that information so that you can put it in words so they can understand it. And I think it was Einstein that said, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. And there's a lot of guys that just hack their way through their jobs every day, swapping parts and figuring out stuff and remembering, getting stuff from information from the older mechanics and all that kind of stuff. But the measure we give when it comes to knowledge or anything else is going to be the measure we'll receive. We'll get more knowledge by giving knowledge away. See, we don't want to be one of those. A lot of these people, I've worked with people that wanted to be the only one that could fix something so that they would feel like they were indispensable at the end of the day. Well, this guy, Jimmy, I went to visit him this morning, by the way, and I'm going to take him to lunch today. He's a guy that I trained back in 2005, and he told me about a transmission situation he encountered on an 01 Power Stroke that had a 4R100 transmission in it. Okay, it was flashing the overdrive light, going into transmission limp-in mode, and a local transmission shop had thrown clutches and seals in there and just rebuilt the transmission right quick, and it's still doing the same thing when they got done. Alright, so if the PCM receives some strange signals that are out of expected range, it will engage self-protection protocols. And what does that mean? They match the severity of the detected fault. It's going to do whatever it can to protect itself from getting burned up. The emergency measures range from a middle light to a shutdown of all the solenoids. Whenever you take the power from all of the solenoids, if you shut them all down, you're basically going to have a hard, harsh shift. Well, that protects the clutches, because if you got one that's shifting softly, like for instance on one of the ones that had the old throttle valve cable or something, the quickest way you could burn a transmission up was leave that throttle valve cable unhooked from the throttle body so that it wouldn't raise the pressure when you went into the throttle, and it was always just barely providing enough pressure to apply the clutches, and they would start slipping and it would burn them out. But it'll usually default the transmission to a single gear, like third or something like that, so that you still got some speed that it'll take off, even if it won't take off as fast as you want it to. So the PCM compares engine speed, turbine shaft speed, output shaft speed, and each gear is engaged so it knows when things aren't the way they should be. So when it's watching all of the speeds of all these shafts, and it knows it's in first, second, third, it knows what the ratio is, it knows how fast they out, it knows if the torque converter clutch is locked, and so on and so forth. So it knows how to calculate all of that stuff. There's actually a way you can calculate it yourself if you want to do the math, but the point is the computer does it on the fly. And when it goes into limp-in mode, one of the more noticeable things is to raise the line pressure and causes a harsh shift to protect the clutches from slipping. Whenever you had throttle valve pressure and governor pressure, your governor basically and your throttle valve is going back and forth like this. The governor basically changes the pressure so it shifts up through its gears and it goes faster. But whenever you go deeper into it with your throttle valve, it basically would cause it overrides the governor pressure so it holds the gears longer and that kind of stuff. So the results are a harsh shift, healthier for the transmission than a soft shift that can burn out clutches really fast. Well, it compares all these shafts. It'll enter limp-in mode if a speed sensor signal is determined to be untrustworthy or doesn't make sense. Because in those situations, it doesn't know if the transmission is slipping or not, so it errs on the side of caution. So if it doesn't know it's slipping, it's going ahead and raise the pressure just for the fun of it. So what's it looking for? Well, you imagine yourself operating a vehicle you drive every day, and that's where you assume you're paying attention to the tach and the speedometer. We all get used to that. You can look at if you're used to driving and you're used to watching your tach and your speedometer, you know when that stuff's working like it's supposed to. You know when it's not in the proper gear. Like if you've gone too deep, like you go click, 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 and you go to, for instance, you got a D, and then you got a 3, and if you click past it and go into the 3 range, you're going to look at that, wait a minute, the engine's running too fast, what's up with this? Then you click it up into the 4th gear, and it slows down a little bit. Well, when the torque converter is fully engaged, and most of them are modulated now, but when it's fully engaged and it's locked at 100% and you start crowding the throttle in the highest gear, you expect the tach and the speedometer to be going up at about the same speed, right? But if the tach is going up faster than the speedometer when you're not used to seeing that happen, so you got issues, and you know that it's slipping. All right, so in other words, you're doing the same thing the PCM does, only the PCM has a tighter tolerance than you do. It's looking at numbers, you're just looking at needles, right? And that kind of thing. So if a gear is slipping, the worst thing it can do is leave the pressure low enough to burn that little bit of lining off those clutches when they're only half engaged and it's trying to pull that truck. So higher fluid pressure squeezes them together a lot better and makes them less likely to slip. It's programmed to reduce the current to the EPC solenoid and pressure rises, or if it completely, removes the any current to the EPC solenoid. So this is the thing. If something cuts the wire going to all those solenoids in one of these kind of transmissions, it's basically going to drive all the pressures through the roof and everything, you know, and makes it less likely to burn itself up. Now, on some of your Asian transmissions, the ones that are made even on the 4EAT, like in the Escorts and the, you know, all those like that, and on some of the Nissans, they like to hardwire their solenoids to ground and send power from the engine controller down there to control them, which is, you know, seems backwards if you're used to working on domestic stuff, but a lot of that stuff is kind of gone crazy today. Slippage might happen as a result of fluid pressure leak through a cracked casting in the case or valve body, stuck spool valve, and all that. So Jimmy spoke with the transmission tech that built the unit at the other shop, and he said gently applying the throttling gear on an incline would bring the problem on. And so he learned that because he'd been trying for 2 weeks to figure out what was wrong with it. All right, this is kind of funny. Jimmy duplicated a concern to the P0720 frail, also the output shaft speed sensor signal. I stripped through the data stream, was confusing because the vehicle speed sensor was reading 127 miles an hour and the output shaft speed sensor was reading 6,000 RPM with it sitting motionless in the service bay. you got a little bit of a clue about what's going on. So he pulled the output shaft speed sensor, inspected the tone wheel, the borescope, said nothing wrong in there, you know, so he just figured to look at that first. Jimmy's real methodical about the way he goes about his troubleshooting. The hurricane speeds had to be a result of electrical interference. So basically unplug the alternator and all those numbers normalize. Aha, so now we're getting somewhere. This is an electrical interference thing. All right, so what would you do at this point? You gotta repair the concern surgically. You don't want to throw a bunch of parts at it because they've already done that at the transmission shop. And so he cleaned and tightened the battery terminals and fixed the truck. The labor charge was 1 hour. So the only problem this truck ever had, as far as anybody knows, I mean, the guy could have found stuff wrong when he went in there and rebuilt it, but the problem he had when he pulled it out of his service bay, the guy in the transmission shop had the same problem before and after he did the work. And so fixing those battery terminals was all it took to clean that one up. See, the thing about it is, Jimmy gathered the data that he needed, and he checked this and that and the other, and he wound up going, you know, working his way down to the most logical thing. What I'm always thinking about in a situation like this is whenever you're going to make some sort of a decision, my question is, how much trouble is it going to be? How much is it going to cost? What do you got to lose if this is not the problem? You know, and if how hard was it to pull those battery terminals and clean them? It wasn't hard at all to do that. What if you pull it? You know, you might be thinking before you do the repair, you might be thinking, well, there's no way that's going to be the cause of it. And it's like, you know, like the one that we had on that Eagle Summit that time that was doing the tachometer was doing this right here, a little bit of a surge to it, and we wound up changing the transmission fluid because it didn't have friction modifier in it, and it was a modulated torque converter. And it was basically the equivalent of a chatter, like some of your Crown Victorias. I feel like they're running over those speed breakers going down to a stop sign or something. And it turns out that you just need to change the transmission fluid to take care of that because the friction modifier has died, and the torque converter clutch is chattering. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling right now, so I'm going to let you guys go, and I will talk to you next week.